Hi guys, so the flamboyant Tory MP Desmond Swayne was in Parliament and he was asking if Boris Johnson had been abducted because he's avoiding the debate and he's not answering questions on how the UK government are dealing with the pandemic. So let's hear what Sir Desmond had to say.
Sir Desmond Swayne.
Madam Deputy Speaker, less than a year ago I celebrated what I thought was the election of a sceptical and liberal Conservative administration. And now I'm left wondering if the Prime Minister hasn't been abducted by Dr. Strangelove and reprogrammed by the sage over to the dark side. The purpose of politicians is to impose a measure of proportion, a sense of proportion on science, and not to be enthralled to it.
Okay, so he's attempting to say that Boris Johnson and the government are enthralled to science. Well, he couldn't be any further from the truth, because at the beginning of this pandemic, before the first wave, or as the first wave was hitting, the scientists were telling the government, you need to impose a lockdown. Boris Johnson rejected that, dragged his heels, and eventually went into a lockdown. So he was not following the science. The scientists were dragging him to the logical conclusion. The same can be said about masks. Scientists were on the news every night saying people should be wearing masks, people should be maintaining social distancing. This was something that came along after, when it was pretty much too late. And it's still the case where you have members of the government who are appearing in front of cameras not wearing masks. And I've said on numerous occasions on this channel that if politicians set a good example, it will make it easier for the general public to follow through.
Now, I will make myself very unpopular, but I believe that the appearance of the chiefs last week should have been a sacking offence.
That's actually a terrible thing to say, actually. And yes, it will make you unpopular. Well, I hope it does. Those two scientists who were asked to present the uncomfortable information were basically turned into scapegoats. The government continually had been saying how, we're doing very well, we're fighting this thing, we're turning the corner in a positive sense. And it arrived at a stage, I think, where the scientists were saying, you can't continue this way. We need to lock down. We need to impose greater restrictions. We can't continue down this road, because if we do, we're going to see massive infection. We need to inform the public of the situation. Boris Johnson, of course, didn't want to do that because it would make him look bad. Matt Hancock didn't want to do that because it would make him look incompetent. So what did they do? They said to the scientists, you deliver the bad news. We'll deliver the good news. You deliver the bad news. The Tories are defending themselves. They're protecting themselves. That's why they did that.
When they presented that graph, with the caveat that it wasn't a prediction, but nevertheless, it was clear that they presented it as a plausible scenario.
Do you think they would have got the permission to present that graph without Boris Johnson's approval? Without Matt Hancock's approval? Just think about it for a moment. Why were they sent forward to present the bad news? Because Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson didn't want to.
With its 50,000 cases per day by mid-October, based on the doubling of infections by the week. Not once, not on one day since March, have there been infections on that day that were double that of the day of the week preceding. Not once.
Okay, but there are issues of testing. That's why.
Where did this doubling come from? What was their purpose in presenting such a graph? It was the purpose of the fat boy in Pickwick Papers. I wants to make your flesh creep. It was Project Fear. It was an attempt to terrify the British people, as if they haven't been terrified enough.
But who the hell signed off on this? Who gave them the permission to do this? Why are you criticizing the scientists? They're the ones delivering the message. Who gave them the permission to do that? You know who did. I know who did. Why don't we just say it?
Now, I've been banging on about this since March, and every criticism I've made, I've been told that the government was relying on the best possible science. So I am delighted by the letter 1 week ago today, the nuanced criticism of Professors Hennigan, Gupta and Sikora. And I believe that it is now the government that has to answer that criticism. I'm glad that the consensus in the scientific community is broken and the critics are speaking out.
I'm not familiar with who these people are or what they have said. But of course there's going to be, there's not going to be complete consensus on how to deal with the pandemic. Because this is a novel virus. We don't know that much about it. We're still learning about it. So of course there'll be some scientists who will have different opinions.
Underestimate for one moment the horrible nature of this disease and its post-viral syndrome. But in terms of the United Kingdom's killers, it is 24th in the league, accounting for only 1.4 of us.
So, this is the typical response to dealing with it, and you'll find it with many people on the right, conservatives and other people like them. They say, but you know how more people die in car accidents, and we're not imposing a lockdown on cars. More people die of heart disease, but we're not putting a lockdown on McDonald's. More people die from obesity, but we're not putting a lockdown on sugar. Because these things are not contagious. Car accidents are not contagious. Do we still have to explain the difference between a virus and heart disease or obesity or car accidents? Do we really have to go there?
And as a consequence, I believe that the government's policy has been disproportionate. By decree, it has interfered in our private lives and our family lives, telling who...
Okay, so this is just theatre. If these Tory MPs were really concerned about how Boris Johnson is ruling by decree, how Boris Johnson is overreaching, how Boris Johnson is acting anti-democratically, which is quite ironic because these people had no problem with what Boris Johnson was doing last year when it came to Brexit, but we'll park that for a moment. If they were truly concerned, then why don't they call for a vote of no confidence? Why don't they put their money where their mouth is? Bring down the government if they truly believe this is an overreach by the government. Of course they're not going to do that. They'll him and ha, they'll complain, they'll present some political theatre, but that seems as far as they'll go.
We may meet, when we may meet them, and what we must wear when we meet them. We have the cruelty of elderly people in care homes, disoriented, being unable to see the faces of their loved ones and to receive a hug.
Yes, that is, and why are you turning this into a political issue? Do you think that young people are happy that they're not able to hug their elderly grandparents? Do you think that grandparents are happy about this situation either? Of course they're not, but they understand why it's necessary. It's easy for you to say, well, it's just a pile of crap. There is a real risk that those people in that situation, in those vulnerable situations, risk dying. We've seen it. This is not just some hypothetical situation. We have seen the images. We have seen the hospitals filled up on a daily basis. The NHS crying out for help. We have seen it. We have seen frontline staff dying because they were exposed to it as well. It's very easy to sit there in Parliament in a protected environment and say, oh, there's no problem whatsoever.
We have the tsunami of deaths that we may experience shortly as a consequence of undiagnosed cancers and heart disease and the discontinuation of clinical trials. I give way to my right honourable friend.
This is a real issue. The excessive deaths that have been caused by this pandemic are off the scale. Now, there has to be a way to deal with this. We can't close hospitals because there is a pandemic. We need to have particular hospitals open to deal with the pandemic, and we have to have other hospitals open to deal with other issues. I think that's the only way we can go. To have the regular hospitals extremely well controlled. No one can enter unless they have been tested, and they continue to function to provide services, support for people who need it. And then we have our separate hospitals that deal with COVID. That seems to be the only approach I think that's feasible. I think, I'm not an expert on this, of course, but we can't allow so many people to die because of this pandemic. We need to do something.
Friend looked at the advice given to the Swedish government and the different policies they followed, and what does he deduce from that?
I deduce that that was much more proportionate. Of course, all sorts of criticisms are levied against the Swedish government that on examination of the data and comparing like for like actually are without foundation.
So this is another issue that the people on the right will hold up. Sweden, look, Sweden has succeeded. Sweden is the example to follow. There are a number of problems with that. So I'm going to show you some data. So this is, let's start with Sweden itself. So this is from the World Health Organization website. It says here the current situation in Sweden is 90,000 confirmed cases since the beginning of the pandemic, while in Sweden they have lost 5,880 people since the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, so Sweden has a population of about 10 million people, but I'd like to compare it to other countries in Scandinavia. So for example, we have Finland, which has half the population. So it's important to remember that the population of Sweden and Finland are different. Finland has 9,000 cases and 343 deaths. Okay, Finland has about half the population of Sweden, but look at the difference in the number of deaths. 5,000 to Finland's 343. More than 10 times the deaths for double the population. Now, Norway is another example. Norway has about half the population of Sweden as well. Norway has 13,406 cases and 270 deaths. There's 20 times fewer deaths than Sweden. Now, what's the difference between Sweden, Finland and Norway in regards to how they dealt with the pandemic? Well, Finland and Norway imposed a lockdown. Sweden did not. Now, Sweden cannot really be compared to the UK because the population is different, but also there is a difference between the relationship between Sweden's citizens and their government. Sweden said, we're not going to impose a lockdown, but you must maintain social distancing. You must wash your hands. You must not congregate in groups larger than 50 or 30, depending on the time of the pandemic. And the people followed the rules. People trusted their government. I think the government should have imposed a lockdown. They didn't. That was their decision. I think that's probably one of the reasons why they had 5,000 deaths. But they decided, we're not going to impose a lockdown. We're going to give clear rules to the citizens. The citizens followed those rules, and they had that scenario. Now, the UK, where many politicians on the conservative side are saying we should have followed Sweden, but the difference between Sweden and the UK is that Sweden's citizens believe in their government. They follow the rules. In the UK, generally, people are following the rules, but not to the same extent as they are in Sweden.
certainly hold up the Swedish model as an alternative. We have seen the eye-watering costs that we must now all face for a generation, having closed down our economy for all those months as a consequence of the government's policy. The crushing of enterprises, the destruction of livelihoods, the unemployment that we're going to have to face now amongst young people, all as a consequence.
We could almost use this speech. I would actually, if I was a political party, Labour Party, I would take this speech and I would present it on the day of Brexit. Because this is exactly what's going to happen on Brexit Day. Not exactly on Brexit Day, but after Brexit, you're going to see the crushing of enterprise, mass unemployment because companies will be closing. Well, it's already happening, but you know, after 2021, you're going to see it full on. But what was the alternative to this, Desmond? Imagine if you didn't do a lockdown, what would have happened? It would have been worse than this. The NHS would have been overwhelmed. You would end up having to do a lockdown after the NHS was overwhelmed. And then that would have been much more damaging to the economy, because I think you would have to lock down for much longer than you actually did.
Consequence of an overaction. I understand now there's some question as to whether students are to be allowed to return from university at Christmas. Can I say most gently to my honourable friend on the front bench that the last administration that sought to restrain celebrations at Christmas was during the Commonwealth, when the Lord Protector, as a consequence, was left musing in public as to whether, if he were to arm 1 in 10, that would be enough. How many marshals will be required? I conclude by saying that the policy of the government has been disproportionate in response to this threat. There may, Madam Deputy Speaker, be a virus one day that threatens our very way of life. But this isn't it.
Okay. Political theatre, that's all it really is. If he truly felt that the government were overreaching, were going too far, then he could simply call for a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson's government and bring it down. But he's not going to do that. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?